Good afternoon, Mr. Connell. Now we're ready to proceed with Dr. Chaput.
We are, my lord.
Good afternoon, Dr. Chaput. Now, I understand you're willing to affirm?
Yes.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to repeat after me the following words? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Dr. Chaput.
Thank you.
Now, we've scheduled you for the afternoon. I don't know how long your evidence will take, but should you wish to take a break at any time, please just give me an indication and we can take a break. Feel that you're, as it were, in control of the situation. Can I ask you to bear in mind that the whole room needs to hear you? The microphones are there, they should help, but perhaps if you speak a little louder, project a little more, and possibly even a little more slowly than you would normally speak. Thank you.
That's fine.
Now, Mr. Connell.
Yes, good afternoon, Dr.
Hello.
Chaput. I'm going to ask you one or two introductory questions, but first of all, although your name appears on various documents, I'm conscious that you do have a witness statement among them. I'll therefore ask you the formal question I ask everybody, which is, are you prepared to adopt that witness statement as part of your evidence?
Yes.
Thank you. Could you just confirm the date you first joined NHS GGC?
It was at the end of May 2021, I believe the 31st, the very end.
Yes. Thank you. Partly because your name appears on lots of different documents. Can I ask you this? How would you describe your specialism?
That's a good question. My background is a bit unusual for someone perhaps who's now working in a healthcare scientist role. So my background's in environmental microbiology. That has given me some experience and skills that have proven helpful in several different aspects of both the reference laboratories where I am based and on the infection control team. So perhaps experience or skills that are relevant to the work that I've done for the inquiry would be in analysis of large data sets, interpretation of environmental microbiology, and data presentation, visualization, and communication for diverse audiences. And I believe that's perhaps why I have found myself involved more than I perhaps would have predicted at the beginning of my career in GGC.
So if I said to you, are you a microbiologist?
Yes.
Are you an epidemiologist?
That not strictly, no. But then epidemiologist is not a protected title, and people can be different types of epidemiologists. But no, I have not considered myself an epidemiologist strictly.
Well, as you probably have guessed by now, I thought I was calling you in order to talk about your reports on water, and we'll turn to them shortly, but I need to ask you about some other matters as well. And first, could I ask you about a document that you drew sort of incidentally to our attention in the course of last week, which is an article which has been published, and the bundle reference is Bundle 44, Volume 8, at page 141. Now, we can immediately see, of course, that the list of authors includes names familiar to this inquiry.
I think you've probably heard from many of them.
Well, certainly Kerr Clarkson, Dennis Kelly, David Watson, Tom Steele and Alistair Leonard. I'm
Yeah.
not sure we've heard from Dr. Bagrad or Dr. Marek. But anyway, the names are well known to us. For my purposes as counsel to the inquiry, I'm probably more interested in the factual material that is contained within the article, i.e. the events, rather than the views and so forth, which I've associated with it. The topic, and please correct me if at any point I summarize incorrectly, but I would summarize it as indicating that the issue discussed in the article is let me call it a significant challenge encountered. You happy with the phrase?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's an accurate description.
A significant challenge encountered at the point when the refurbished Ward 2A was to be returned to practical use.
Yes, that's correct.
And that challenge was, and again, I'm reading a lot of technical matters very short, but essentially a heavy load of microbiological proliferation found in the water system, perhaps unexpectedly. Is that fair?
Unexpected. That would be fair. Heavy load is a relative term. We have strict microbiological thresholds for water, and after the reconstruction of that ward was completed, despite best efforts, the threshold, the microbial counts in the ward that had been closed for 3 years at this point were above what was acceptable to us. Yeah.
Oh, I'm happy not to get into debate with you about the precise meaning
of
of
course.
heavy.
But yes, that's the situation we were facing.
Yeah.
That will also be reflected in some of the other material you've seen.
And what the article goes on to discuss is what had been done during the period when the ward was closed, and then what was done to try to resolve the issue that you'd
precisely
unexpectedly encountered. Now, this is the material within the article, and I won't always say that because it becomes very laborious. This material is perhaps, I would suggest to you, potentially relevant to the inquiry in a number of respects. I'll just run through these briefly and see whether you agree. First of all, one of the inquiry's questions is everything safe now?
Of course, yeah.
And at least in principle, the material discussed here is relevant to that question.
Yes.
It may be relevant to the inquiry's consideration of microbial biofilms, which it's had at various points. Would you agree?
Yes.
To the challenge, which we've discussed in other contexts, of keeping unoccupied, non-operational areas safe in terms of water system.
Yes.
To the efficacy or otherwise of carbon dioxide dosing as a method of, let me call it
Sorry,
disinfecting.
did you say carbon dioxide?
Carbon dioxide.
Chlorine dioxide.
Chlorine
Chlorine dioxide dosing. Yes, my fault entirely. Chlorine dioxide dosing. And perhaps finally and I'll just use this in a non-technical sense, the vulnerabilities of thermal mixing taps.
Yeah, that would be accurate.
Yeah. I suppose the next question I'm bound to ask you, I'm afraid, is the fact of the significant challenge and the issues that arose around it. Are you able to help us at all as to why the inquiry wasn't aware of this before you incidentally referenced this material last week?
Aware of this exact publication?
No, of the problem that had arisen back in 2021-22.
I don't believe this is there are certainly other documents that refer to this. If I refer to, actually from my bundle, all the presentations I prepared, that would have been in February, March 2022. There's a list of presentations from that time, and these all detail the process that we went through to recommission that ward. I could give you some document numbers if that would help.
Well, I have all your presentations. I'll
So
go through them.
all those documents, this
later on.
process has been referred to, I believe, in Dr. Walker's material at great length. And I did not intend to surprise the inquiry with this. This occurred in 2021, 2022, and we recommissioned the ward with oversight or assistance from NHS Assure. The Scottish Government was involved. There will be a lot of documentation around this process. And so the intention in publishing a paper about it, we did not publish this paper for the inquiry.
No.
This is because we were facing a tricky situation, but not one that I believe is unique to this hospital. It's a challenge that other teams in other health boards may face. And I found that our approach ultimately proved successful. We learned a lot during it. And let me also say this was very much a multidisciplinary team effort, as you can see by the author list. I'm only the first on the list because I led on the writing up of the paper, but this was very much a team effort. And the amount of data that we gathered through that process is extremely valuable because it adds to the evidence base for how one manages water systems under different challenges. So this paper, I realize it was published, I think, in May of this year, but to get to that point, that manuscript we submitted in, I believe it was December 2024. It's gone through fairly extensive peer review. This is a fairly high impact journal, which means it's quite difficult to get a paper into one of these, and the peer review is extensive, and these were international peer reviewers. And so we wanted to accomplish a few things. We wanted to share lessons learned. We wanted to be open about our data and our processes. And we wanted to, specifically with this work, seek international reviewers to confirm our belief that we are working to an extremely high standard amongst this team.
Well, I'm absolutely clear. I make no criticism of you for preparing the article. I make
No, of course.
no suggestion that you personally were trying to ambush us with something by footnoting it in something else you sent us. It may be entirely my fault, but I hadn't been aware that there was this significant challenge encountered that had given rise to such, quite difficult issues which you had to spend a lot of time resolving.
It was a significant challenge, but I also don't want to overstate the severity of the situation we were facing. I mean, yes, we had high counts that were above our thresholds, and therefore for us within GGC, we could not reopen that ward. But context is important here. So the counts we are talking about at the worst point, which was when it was handed back over to us, and we did that initial sweep in September 2021. Elsewhere, those, especially the TVC counts, there are no strict thresholds for TVC. It's a monitoring tool. And so it's not that we had dramatic, uncontrolled overgrowth in that system. Actually, I would say that given it had been closed for 3 years, it wasn't entirely unexpected. And I think that one of the points that I do make in this paper is that we adhered and in fact exceeded the guidance in place. As you can imagine, there was a lot of scrutiny on everyone involved in this work. So, of course, we did everything not only by the book, but as I explained in the paper, we exceeded. We took every measure that we could think of to protect that water system. And so if there was some proliferation in it, I say in this paper, given it was closed for 3 years, this isn't a 3-week closure. This is a 3-year closure. The advice or from our experience, other health boards facing a similar situation might want to anticipate needing a recommissioning period like this, that just flushing once or twice a week, according to guidance, may not be sufficient.
I understand all of that. Thank you. In this forum, I don't think it's going to be helpful for me to try to go through the entire paper because we'll be here long after we're meant to be somewhere else. I just want to try and make sure I'm picking up correctly some of the key points. Now, one of them is, in a sense, the point that you've just made, that there is guidance for what you're meant to do when you have just call it an unoccupied area for whatever reason. And you point out that once or twice a week flushing is what is suggested, and you did it once a day, as I understand.
We did, and we ramped that up.
And in addition, just so I'm getting it all correctly, you also make the point that at the same time, this particular hospital system was subject to the chlorine dioxide dosing.
It was.
Which not all systems will have for whatever
Correct.
reason, because that had been introduced, as we know, after the water incident in 2018. So you've got both the chlorine dioxide continuing and a regime which exceeds guidance, but nevertheless, you encountered this challenge.
Some proliferation.
Just so that I just want to try and make sure we have, at least for present purposes, as it were, for the record, some dates. The construction works were finished in September 2021.
That's correct.
Secondly, and this is just because we've become obsessed with something called horn taps in this inquiry. These were not horn taps.
No, there were no horn taps.
These were armated shanks, Markwick
21 plus, if
taps.
I believe, yeah.
But nevertheless, thermostatic mixer.
They were, yeah.
Taps. What you ultimately did, and if I'm, again, same point, if I summarize incorrectly, just stop me, was you took, apart from the general question of ramping up the use of the water systems in the ward to more closely mimic an operational ward, in terms of specific interventions, if I can call them that, you did 3 things.
That's correct.
One, you did chlorine dioxide dosing at a level which you would use to disinfect a new system.
So this, yes, and if I could just correct, it was chlorine dosing rather than chlorine dioxide. So it was sodium hypochlorite.
Okay.
And I did get that. Some of my slides from years ago might have mixed up the two as well. So if there's any confusion, I may be partly responsible. But no, it was sodium hypochlorite, so that's chlorine. And it was a treatment level dose, not a maintenance dose.
Yeah. So this is different from the ongoing
Oh,
chlorine
yes.
dioxide dosing that was in the system more widely in the hospital.
Yes, because ongoing chlorine dioxide is at a relatively low level because that water is being used.
And the second step you took was a
different disinfectant.
different disinfectant.
Yeah, it was hydrogen peroxide.
Yeah. Which you describe in the paper as typical to what someone would call a shock disinfection,
That's correct.
sometimes used when an incident has occurred.
These are terms I've learned from the water engineers that I've worked with. But yes, it's been described as a shock dosing, so a higher level to recover an unfavorable situation.
Yeah. And then the third thing was you changed all the taps.
That was the final intervention. That was in January, early January 2022.
And as I understand it, that was because the chlorine intervention didn't seem in and of itself to fix the problem. Is that correct?
And the way we were able to show that was through systematic sampling, before and after, and for context on the floors above and below, which had remained operational throughout.
And then you used the hydrogen peroxide shock dosing, which, again, using non-technical terms, made quite a bit of improvement.
It did.
But didn't entirely resolve everything you wanted resolved.
Precisely.
And then finally, you changed the taps.
We did.
And you're very careful to say in the papers, I recall, that while the tap change seemed to lead to a solution, you're not suggesting that it of itself, without other things, would have solved it, because they would simply have become recolonized.
That was a concern. You need to make sure, if you're dealing with a situation like this, that you're dealing with the entirety of the source. And so if the issue is not strictly limited to your taps, then yes, replacing all the taps would lead to very rapid recolonization of those taps. So in our case, we worked from the inside of the system through to the taps. So shock dosing of all the pipe work and of the taps, of course, because that chemical goes through the taps, but with the final step of replacing the taps.
So you're very careful to say you're not suggesting that's the solution. You're simply saying A plus B plus C seem to resolve it.
Exactly.
Plus the other practical measures on the ward.
Exactly. So this was a live situation. This was not a scientific experiment. These interventions were carried out sequentially. So although it appears that the chlorine alone didn't work, I cannot say that it didn't contribute to the resolution of the situation. And we have to be very clear about that, because there is no quick fix often to these. And so I would not want this to be misinterpreted as saying, well, just swap out your taps and you'll be fine. We did assess as best we could with data from a live situation the effects of the individual interventions, but there could very well be, and likely was, a cumulative effect, along with the more gradual interventions that we could not measure because they did not have a specific start point. So we increased the cleaning to the point where that ward was being cleaned to clinical standards while it was still closed. That could have had an impact. We increased the flushing even more. Things like that changed over the timeline. So there are some confounders to this, but because we sampled quite in quite a granular way, 4 days a week, before, after, and it wasn't a quick, let's take one sample before and one sample after. Microbiology data is generally too noisy for that. You need trends. And so we collected a large number of samples over many days, floors above and below for context, and then before and after each intervention. But yes, long answer to your question. Was it likely cumulative? Yes, it probably was.
Just so again, I have it, in your paper, you show the results of testing in the floors above and below.
I do.
Which reveal positive tests for a variety of organisms, but not at the same, let me just use the word level for the moment,
Yes.
as on 2A.
In September, October.
Yeah.
That's correct. And that's important because water is not sterile. Tap water is not sterile. Even with chlorine dioxide, it is unrealistic to expect 0 counts in every water test in a potable water system. And so in order to determine whether there's an additional microbiological burden in a particular area, you need to know what that baseline is that you are comparing to. Additional to what? Because the standard is not, is this sterile water? And so the reason we sampled on the floors above and below was to set that baseline, because we needed to confirm first, is this isolated to that ward? Now, of course, we sample across the Queen Elizabeth all the time. So we have a very good understanding of the microbiology, but I wanted samples on exactly the same day as when we were sampling in 2A, so that we had exactly comparable data. And as you noted, there are counts occasionally, and you detect gram-negative organisms, and you get occasional total viable counts. And that is our normal variability.
But this paper doesn't discuss the topic of what conclusions might be drawn from the counts in the other wards. It
No.
simply focuses on that as a check.
No, because
these are the same wards used by I think the same water riser. Is that right?
it is.
Yeah.
So that's the same feeds coming up from the basement tank system and feeding each of these 3 floors.
Can I ask you one? I think we can see that the conclusion, in a practical sense, is you apply the various measures, you then do testing, followed by more testing and more testing, and you're then satisfied that if you assume it's a challenge, you have resolved the challenge.
Yes.
Of course, this inquiry has been considering other parts of the history of the new hospital. And I was wondering whether I would find much discussion about that in here, and the answer is no.
No.
The only part I could find, when you turn to the discussion, now, to some extent, parts of the paper repeat things that are said elsewhere in the paper because they're parts that laid out in factual narrative, then they're returned to in the discussion.
Of course.
So I make no comment on how one writes a paper to get it into water research. That's a matter you know better than I do. But at the start of the discussion, you say this: in any engineered water distribution system, periods of decreased or interrupted water use can lead to proliferation of microbial flora. And then you say, especially in systems that might have pre-existing biofilm. Now, you then move on to discuss the interventions. Do you know the extent to which what you found was influenced by the presence of pre-existing biofilm?
No. And I can't see how one would necessarily know that, would be able to. Can I also just perhaps clarify? My background's environmental microbiology, and specifically biofilms for some of the work I've done.
Well, I was going to ask you about
Yeah.
that.
And biofilms develop wherever you have an interface between two states. So that could be solid air, desk. It can be water, air. And so if you leave a vase of flowers out, you get a bit of a scummy layer on the top. That's a biofilm. It's at the interface between the liquid and the air. And you get biofilms between solid and liquid. So on pipes, on stones in a stream. I don't know that biofilm development can be entirely prevented. Microorganisms are hardy. And some of my doctoral work looked at some of the most extreme environments that are on the limits of what should be possible for life, and you still found biofilms. These are on rocks in the high Arctic. So solid air biofilms. So I would question any claim that a water system was free of any biofilm. I think our goal is to manage systems to make it as inhospitable as possible for those biofilms to grow. But I'm not sure it's realistic to claim that there will never be, that it's possible in any water system, I'm including a domestic, not specifically hospitals, but to say that you can operate a system and there will not be any biofilm anywhere, it is unrealistic. Now, of course, this is not to say, well, biofilm's expected, we should just live with it. No, of course not. This is a balance of risk, and what we want to do is minimize the growth of biofilm. As I said, we want to make it as inhospitable as possible.
And why is that? What's your objective in minimizing biofilm?
Well, biofilm is where microbes have a safe environment to proliferate, and it protects them. It has numerous features that protect them from disinfectants, for example, provides a nice little niche where there's more nutrient, and they multiply. And if that's allowed to happen, then it can grow and grow, and your microbial load increases, and then it can shed into the system. This is not new.
No, I mean, I realize that in a sense an obvious question, but
Yeah.
Can I just come back and then ask you so your understanding of biofilms, is that based on your doctoral work that you've just described?
Doctoral, postdoctoral work, and general environmental microbiology training, and now, since I joined the NHS, clinical training, because of course biofilms are very relevant in clinical microbiology as well. They cause all kinds of trouble. If they grow on implants or on lines, they're very difficult to treat because the biofilm is protective for the microorganisms.
Thank you very much. I think I'll leave the article down because we can all read it.
No,
I don't think there's any point in my going through the detail of it unless your lordship.
If I could add one, oh, sorry, please go ahead.
No, add away.
So also in terms of biofilm, it's very difficult to directly measure biofilm unless you go into the pipes and take some kind of direct measurement, then in fact, you're assuming that there's biofilm there based on what you're finding in the water, in the bulk water. I mean, pipe sampling is very destructive and difficult, and you would need to do a lot of it. And this, we're getting back to normal variability, but it's more of a problem with biofilms because they're spatially heterogeneous. So if I sample one pipe, that tells me nothing about the biofilm that's 1 centimeter away, let alone 1 meter away, let alone in the tap. So it is not realistic to expect direct biofilm sampling. This determination that there was biofilm is an assumption that follows from the water testing results, which is the bulk water. Now, there are some hints. If the organisms you're finding in your bulk water are species that are known biofilm formers, that's an indication that perhaps there is a biofilm somewhere. But that's an indirect measurement. Unless you are generally destructively sampling your pipes, cutting section of pipes out, then you're not generally measuring biofilm directly.
And even if you cut out pipes A, B, C, and D, it may tell you nothing about what's
Pipe
in
E,
E,
F,
F,
G.
G, and H.
Precisely.
Yeah. Or even what's in another bit of a nearby pipe.
And perhaps another point, if I may. The users of the water outlet, whoever's interacting, that will be patients, staff, what's important for them is what's in the water. Now, if there's a very hardy, thin, tough layer of biofilm that's having extremely difficult time because we're bombarding it with chlorine dioxide and pushing the water through, if it's not allowed to grow to a certain thickness and it's not shedding anything into that water, A, we won't see it, but B, does it matter for the user of that outlet? Now, of course, it matters if that biofilm is growing and shedding, but we would see that in the water results, the bulk water. So the mere existence of a biofilm alone is not a direct indication of the risk. The risk is when that biofilm, what's in it, which organisms, is it growing to the point where it is able to shed into the water? If your water results are not showing, and I don't mean one isolated water sample, because that tells you that one sample has nothing in it, but as we know, biofilms don't shed constantly, right? They slough off in pulses. But if we sample to the level that we're sampling in this hospital, that does give us some reassurance that if there is a biofilm in there, it is not significantly impacting on the water that's coming out of that tap in any way that we're able to measure. Is that clear? What's really important for the patients and the users is what's coming out of the tap.
Would it be true to say, Dr. Chaput, that if one has responsibility for managing a complex water system, in the absence of control mechanisms, and by that I mean temperature control, and if you opt for it, chemical control, and regular flushing, it would be prudent to assume that biofilm is developing in that system.
Yes, if you do not have a good handle on those control measures, then yes, I would say that is a very real risk.
And taking into account what you say about the possibility of the biofilm being so robust or presumably coherent, but it does not shed. If you are managing a system, it would be prudent to assume that biofilm may shed.
Yes, I think it's prudent to assume many things when managing water systems and not to rely on any one control measure, or for that matter, and this coming from someone who is a scientist and relies on data, not to rely entirely on testing results either. And this is known in certainly in the context of Legionella. That's, I think, fairly well understood in the, if you like, water engineering or water management community, that Legionella testing results provide some reassurance, but they do not prove absence. You cannot prove absence. You can only try to look for a problem, but none of those answers are absolute.
And when we're talking about water sampling, help me with this. You will discover what you're looking for.
Yes, and that is a crucial point.
So the value of water sampling depends on which as I understand it, all water sampling should provide a total viable count. Is that right?
I don't know if the
Right.
total viable count is one type of microbiological test.
Right. And that is and that is a regular part.
There are international standards and protocols. It's a very widely used test that has been developed and refined over decades.
And in addition to that, you have to test for specific organisms if you wish to detect them.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the total viable count test, if it's done according to standard protocols, does not tell you the identification of the organisms that you have grown. So the culture media used in the laboratory is meant to be broad, non-selective, because you're trying to capture as many of the organisms in there as possible. But it will not tell you what they are. Whereas something like a Legionella test is looking specifically for Legionella.
Another slightly different topic before I invite Mr. Connell to resume. If one reads the article in Water that Mr. Connell has been asking you about, one gets the impression that GDC were conducting a particularly focused and organized project. Now, reading an article can often give you the wrong impression. Would that be a correct? There was a team, there was a method, and there was a focus.
That's correct. This was, if you like, a standalone project. It was a situation, but it was a very specific situation, limited in time and space, remember? And therefore, this was the water safety technical group who worked on this. And we worked on it very intensively over a fixed period of time, because it was one problem that had to be resolved, because that ward needed to reopen. But we would not reopen it until we had reassured ourselves and everyone else who was looking at this quite closely that we were ready to reopen. And so it was a very specific piece of work, and almost if you like, experimental design, as best as we were able to put one in, not to do an experiment, but to get the data that we needed to provide that reassurance.
Now, we have, as Mr. Connell has identified, a number of presentations prepared by you, which are part of the inquiry's documentation. Now, if I was to reread these presentations, would I detect within them that a project such as you've described was ongoing in the hospital from as early as 2021?
I'm not quite sure I follow. So by project, I don't want to say that this was some kind of experiment we were doing for scientific reasons. We had a situation and we had to address it. And in the methodology we used, I guess could be described as a type of experimental design, but that wasn't to do an experiment. That was to get the data that we needed to address the situation. And so the other documents that you have were prepared during this time. And it was to give, and I prepared these almost weekly, much smaller versions, but as the water results would come in from our sampling, I would do a live update, if you like, of the figures that are in the paper and that are in these slides. And that was to communicate to the rest of the water safety technical group exactly what was happening as close to real time as possible so that we could decide on the next course of action. So it wasn't a research project in that sense. It was, here's a situation. It's quite a high pressured situation and we felt quite serious in that we did need to reopen this ward. And therefore, how do we best resolve it?
Well, that's a full answer, but can I return to the question?
Yes, of course. So what specifically?
We've just received this or recovered this document. And I think Mr. Connell was putting to you that this is news to us. And I understood from your answer to say, well, you've had my presentations, as indeed we have. So
I believe it should be clear, yes.
Excuse me. My question was, should I have picked up in my reading of your presentations that what I have described as a project was ongoing?
I would have hoped so, but if you didn't, then that's perhaps a failure of communication on my part.
Or a failure of understanding on my part?
Perhaps. But keep in mind, those presentations were not prepared for this inquiry. They were prepared at the time with a specific purpose and for a specific audience. I believe some of them were presentations that I gave during meetings with NHS Assure. And I mean, there are several of them. It would probably take too long to go through them, but I do begin with September 2021. And here's the situation we faced in September 2021. Here are the interventions. Here's what we know so far. And then depending on the date, as you see, there's some that go from February to the end of March because this was a live situation. I would hope there's nothing self-contradictory, but new data was coming through. And so the very last one is the most complete. The earlier one from February would have only had the story up to February. But I would hope, I think they always start with the premise, which is we are planning to reopen this ward. Here is what our sampling sweep in September 2021 detected, and here is how we are addressing this.
Thank you. Mr. Connell.
A little while back in these exchanges, you mentioned, obviously, you're adding to your experience since you came to NHS GGC. And because not everybody knows exactly what that has involved, can I just ask you this? Am I right in understanding that your role doesn't involve any clinical treatment work?
No, I'm laboratory based.
So you don't do things like chair an IMT?
No.
What about advise an IMT?
I have attended, and so on the infection control team, my role perhaps is best described as scientific or data support. So if there's a situation where an ICD perhaps wants to look more closely at some data to support a decision or to inform a decision, then they could request my help with that. But no, I'm not generally directly involved in IMTs.
Thank you. Now, it may be important, so we don't miss anything, to make sure that we understand what you have produced at various times.
Yeah.
So if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'm not going to go to all of them, otherwise we definitely would be here until sometime next week. But I have notes about a number of reports you prepared, so for the record, I'm just going to run through them and then I'm going to come back to one only.
That's fine, yeah.
There's a report on the 3rd of March, which we have in Bundle 18, Volume 1, page 13. We don't need to bring any of these up on screen, thank you. We have something called a whole campus water summary testing report from March 23, which is in Bundle 19, Document 18. We have a summary of legislation and guidance for testing, Bundle 19, Document 54. We have a presentation that you made about 2A, 2B water test results on 28th March 23. I'm sorry, these may not be in chronological order.
No, that's
Bundle
that's
18, page 1030. We have another presentation on the 8th of February 22. Bundle 18, page 1040. Now, I think, having just looked at that, we may find that that includes narratives such as chlorine treatment didn't shift the problem, to turn it into layman's terms.
Of course, yeah, that was our understanding at the time.
There's a little bit of narrative attached to the lists of results. We have another presentation about 2A, 2B water results on the 1st of March 23, Bundle 18, page 1063. And finally, on my list, a presentation on the 18th of February. So I've been proved right, they're not in chronological order, at page 1073 of the same bundle. Now, these are what we think we have. Do you think we've got what we need?
I think so. And if you look through those, they may begin to sound repetitive because these were, if you like, these were presentations to give updates. So they happened, they were, as new results came in, I would update the slides with the new results and then prepare a presentation with the updates. So yes, but they were all prepared over this period of reopening, and that was because, and I touch upon this in the paper a little bit, but there was an interesting recommendation. This was, I cite it and I won't be able to recall it in the heat of the moment, but about something called holistic water system management or something like that. And I actually only came across the reference when I was writing this, but they have some tenets or some recommendations, and one of them is to involve a multidisciplinary team, which we had been doing, but also that a critical aspect of this is the communication. Because when you have a multidisciplinary team, people have very different backgrounds. And so communication of technical material is critical if we are all going to solve this problem together. And so really the goal of these many presentations that was to present the data in a way that my team members could understand, and I sought feedback and I think they found it helpful, so that we all knew, or that we all had a similar understanding of what we were facing week on week. So these are not standalone documents. Well, I suppose they were standalone at the time, but they must be considered within the context and remembering the audience that they were aimed at.
Well, I can understand that in relation to the presentations. I may have slightly different questions to ask you about the report I'm now going to go to.
Of course.
Which is, I think I quoted it as 2022, but it's the 3rd of March 2023, which is in bundle 18 at page 13, if we could have that, please. No, 1-3, sorry. Now, I think the first question I have about this fairly lengthy report, and I'm not going to go through the detail of it because we can see what it says, is how did this come to be prepared?
It's a good question.
What was the point?
Why?
Yeah, because it doesn't. If I can make a suggestion to you, and you can agree or disagree, the one thing it doesn't have is any context. It's simply a collection of data.
Well, I don't know if this doesn't have any context. I think it provides context. What it does not have is an analysis in any way that I would normally consider an analysis. So it does not pose a specific question, nor does it try to carry out any statistical analysis to address a question. This was, so if I could give you how this arose.
Well, I think
Yeah.
the reason I'm asking is that it doesn't discuss events so much as test results.
It is. The purpose was never to discuss events. The point of this, so when I joined the reference labs in late spring 2021, with an environmental microbiology background, within probably a month or two, I was asked by Professor Leonard if I could, because of my background in large data sets, or analyzing or looking at large data sets, and my environmental microbiology background, would I be able to, for internal purposes, gather together and summarize all of the water testing that was done at the QE-UH since it opened in 2015. Now, that's not to say that they didn't know what testing was done, but as you might have read in this report, testing changed considerably over that time. In the earlier period, it was carried out by a contractor, Alcontrol, both the sample collection and the sample testing. And then at a later point, DMA Canyon became involved, and then there was a shift from testing. Alcontrol stopped being involved, and the GGC Environmental Laboratory carried out the testing. Throughout the period, that environmental laboratory was also carrying some other testing in specific areas with their own arrangements. So essentially, it was bitty. There were different data sets in different spreadsheets, and I was asked, just so, because of this inquiry, could we just gather all the data in one place so that we have a starting point and an understanding of which lab was testing what, when, how did the numbers change over this time, which types of tests were performed at what periods. All of those things have shifted considerably over the period 2015 to 2020. And it was difficult to keep it all in your head. So it was to put everything in one place. It's a summary, and that was its purpose. It was not to make any tests as to whether things were higher or lower in terms of results or counts at any one period compared to another. There's no statistical analysis here. This is purely a fairly dry and presentation of numbers.
And to get the information to create this document, am I right in taking from your preceding answer that in essentially what you did was interrogate the various data sets and put them all, try to bring them all together?
Correct. And I had to get those from different sources. The water testing that's carried out by the environmental laboratory is recorded in our laboratory information management system, our LIMS, that's Telepath. But then the earlier AL control data that lived on specific AL control spreadsheets that were, of course, formatted differently, recorded differently. Then there's how DMA Canyon handles data, and a lot of the testing of samples collected by DMA Canyon is carried out in the environmental laboratory, but not all. The Sentinel outlets, those samples, due purely to capacity, are sent to Intertech, a different lab. So the Intertech data, there's a complex web of different data sources. And by the complex web, I mean, if you look at the entire timeline, it's far more straightforward and streamlined now. Because it's a very well established system. But I was asked to go back to 2015. And so to get all of these numbers in what looks quite a dry report involved bringing together data sets, especially from different laboratories, that it takes some work to bring those data sets together.
So at this point, you weren't asked, because you were basically carrying out a task you were asked to do.
It was purely a data collection and summarizing task.
And you weren't asked to go and read any of the materials, water technical group materials or anything of that kind?
No, I was, frankly, at that time I had just started and I was quite oblivious to the whole thing.
Yeah. So why things were happening at a particular time?
Of course, I knew some of the background.
Yes, but that's not what was to go in here.
No, of course not. No, the point of this was just, can we see the trend and show us all the numbers over this timeline and what were the results? How did testing change over this timeline? And that's really quite important to understand that water testing, the types of tests that have been carried out have changed substantially over this time. And it was important to summarize that all in one place.
That's what I was wondering, because if you say, oh, this is to let us know the numbers between 2015 and 2020 of various tests, in some respects that becomes then meaningless, because there are some tests that were not done at all other than in one period, or mainly in one period.
Yeah. And this is why in this report, I don't just present the number of samples that were collected, because it's far more complex than that. You collect a sample, and then either you just put it through a single test, say a Legionella test, or you collect a sample and you test it for, say, Legionella and TBCs, or you collect a sample and you do the full suite of tests. So getting a handle on the number of samples, but how does that translate into the number of different tests? How many organisms have we tested for in this sample? How do we deduplicate, right? Because depending on how this is recorded, I might have an entry in multiple entries in my spreadsheet, single sample, 4 different tests. That could be recorded in different ways, as you could imagine. So it was frankly quite a tedious data analysis task, but quite an important one, I think, to inform future discussions. If we start with a clear understanding of what happened, that's a good starting point.
Well, the what happened, insofar as this document informs you, is what tests were done.
Precisely, yeah. Nothing more than that.
Yeah, because it doesn't otherwise tell you what happened.
No, not the larger question. By what happened, I'm being quite specific in terms of what happened with water testing.
Yeah. So, for instance, just to take an example, with a lot of testing going on around Ward 2A, when it wasn't being occupied by patients. But you don't link that event.
Well, that happened after this report. This report ended in 2020. Had I extended the timeline, keep in mind I started this in 2021, so I was only halfway through 2021. So my instruction was, please summarize 2015 to 2020. Now, had I been doing this last year, I would have included that extra work because the point is to include all the testing.
Can I ask you a purely technical question?
Please.
At various points in this paper, you refer to something called WQS 017.
017, yeah.
Yeah, which is an SOP.
It is.
Now, that of course sent us off to look for WQS 017, and then we discovered there were any number of different versions of that over the years.
Yes.
The earliest we found, and this is probably our fault, is version 2 from 2020. By the time you get to 2024, you're on version 13, which
Yes.
looks very different from version 2. I can dig them out if we need, but I suspect I don't need to do that. What are you referring to in this report?
Well, it would have been the one that was in date at the time that I did this work. So the one that was in date in 2021, and I would be happy to look back because I will have kept a list of the documents, actually a folder of the documents I referred to. But it has that's the estates SOP.
Yes.
For water sampling. Yeah.
Well, that's fine. That you will have used the SOP, which was in date at the time you did your report.
Yes.
But no doubt, if we need to, we can go and follow the trail through. It's just that it wasn't clear to me.
If I didn't specify the version, yeah, then no, that's.
Now, just in terms of what this tells us, apart from obvious things like some things were not tested at all at certain points, we know dates for events such as putting on point of use filters.
Correct.
Let's say February of 18. Things like carbon dioxide dosings in November of 18. So we know these events in the context that we're discussing matters. In terms of testing for Cupra viridis and Pseudomonas before that, am I right in thinking there was either nothing or not very much?
Of specific testing.
Yes.
Pseudomonas testing is a recognized standardized test, and you might have to. I do show a plot of specific Pseudomonas testing in this.
Let's look at page 21. That's electronic page 21 at the top right-hand corner, where you have a table 2.
Yeah.
And that shows
there were some Pseudomonas tests being carried
some,
out.
but not for that many, perhaps, for a hospital of that size. And then much increased numbers.
From December 2018, as you can see, all the numbers increase. As for Cupra viridis testing, no, there was none because that is not a standardized test. That's bespoke to this.
Can we find anything in this report about Stenotrophomonas?
So Stenotrophomonas would be, so let me clarify, when it says Cupra viridis, that it was initially named that in the data set, and Cupria vitis was reported separately, but it's a single test. It's a single agar plate, and it's now been called the gram-negative test. So you take 100 milliliters of water, put it through a filter, and this gram-negative test then identifies and reports the species that it finds. So it's a single test, and that test should pick up Cupria vitis, Stenotrophomonas, and all the other gram-negatives that I report from the period when this test was performed onwards. The bulk of those would have been picked up on this test. So that's essentially the test for Stenotrophomonas as well, if you like.
Right. And that starts in 2018.
So it was first introduced in March, but not as a routine test. That was at the height of the concerns. And this was a new test. This had not been done before. And so the lab developed a method, and that was the first time that specific growth medium and protocol was used. And so there was a large sampling effort in March, April 2018. There's a graph of this if we're able to go to it, but otherwise I can try to describe. And then it was implemented routinely from the end of 2018. And can I also say no one else does this test routinely? This is bespoke to the Queen Elizabeth. So we have no comparative data apart from, and I hope we will get to this, a very useful paper where this test as an experiment or as a project, to use that term, this test was performed at other hospitals.
What about Enterobacter? Is that covered by the same point you're making?
So Enterobacter is a gram-negative. It's also a coliform. So coliforms are part of what's called, if you see this table, potable tests. What's under that column includes, in fact, 4 columns of data, 3 specific tests. So under potable tests, we have TVC, so total viable counts, at 2 different temperatures, at 22 degrees and at 37. So 1 sample of water, 2 different plates, 2 incubation temperatures, and that's to try to capture a wider diversity. The 37 is to try to target those that might prefer to grow at body temperature.
I'm sure I should know this, but the reference to potable tests, is that by reference to the wholesome water criteria, or is it something
Not
else?
specifically, no. Potable testing includes, it's a standard suite of tests for testing potable water, and it includes total viable counts, coliforms, and E. coli. So the wholesome, I think, no, you're not off base. The potable standards for the water utilities do include TVC testing, I believe coliforms, E. coli, and then some additional ones, I believe Clostridium, fecal contaminants, indicators of fecal contaminants. So within the potable testing, we have the total viable count, the TVC tests, as well as the coliforms and E. coli. And Enterobacter are targeted by the coliform test. If they are there, they should grow on that coliform test. They might also grow on the gram-negative test. Essentially, they have 2 shots at it. If I have a single water sample and I've put it on both a coliform plate and a general gram-negative plate, I would hope that it would grow on one or both of those. Certainly the coliform agar is a standard nutrient media that targets coliforms, including Enterobacter.
So we're wrong to look in this report for specific discussion of Stenotrophomonas or Enterobacter because they are subsumed in these other headings that you've given us.
No, because in the later sections, I give details of all the species that were identified.
Yes.
So I give the numbers of all the Stenotrophomonas and all the Enterobacter that were identified. I believe there's quite a long table.
Yeah.
There's also a visualization of the main taxa. So these would have been any species that was reported on the gram-negative test or that was named from the Pseudomonas test, including, and this is important as well, non-target species, because when we say a Pseudomonas test, that agar, that nutrient media, has been refined over the years to target Pseudomonas, but it's not perfect. You get other things that grow on there. And so the lab will, before it reports a count of Pseudomonas, it needs to be sure that those are Pseudomonas. And occasionally, and this is not required, but in the data set, occasionally there would be information on non-target species. So all of those are listed here. Any named species that was in any entry of any of the 80 plus, 90 plus spreadsheets is in here. There are no named species. Oh yeah, I'm not perfect, so maybe there's one or two that slipped, but my intention was to list everything that had ever been detected in those water samples. And
you also list occasions when specific, as you describe them, ad hoc tests were sent to look for particular organisms.
so that's a different type of request again. So the tests we've discussed so far, the gram-negative one is a special case perhaps, but the others are what would be considered routine tests. So if you have a routine sampling plan in place for prospective sampling, for monitoring, generally, if you choose to do so, and it's not required specifically in guidance, but if you choose to do so, you would usually do something like TVC testing, standard Pseudomonas test. There are some tests that are standard. There are well-established ISO standard protocols. Then the ones that you've just mentioned are, I would categorize, and I think I do, as reactive testing or ad hoc testing. And this is not planned in advance as part of monitoring. This is because there's been a request by the infection control team, or perhaps as a result of an IMT, and they've said, look, we've noticed some cases of this. Please, can you test the water specifically for this organism? So it's a different type of test. And the lab, and this has changed a bit over the years. The earlier data sets did record non-target, but the lab would report a yes/no. So I'm asking you, is there an Elizabeth kingia in these water samples? And so that's the question, and the lab's answer would be yes or no, generally. So that section of the report where I give numbers is, these are the tests with that specific request. And then I believe I give the numbers, well, they're all zeros, of when that specific organism was found. It's a different type of testing. It's reactive testing as opposed to routine testing.
Yeah, just for I don't think we need to go there, but so everybody's clear, that appears on page 38 of this report, and it's headed Table 4, Organism-Specific Ad Hoc Tests Requested Across the New Buildings.
Correct.
That's what we've just been discussing.
That's what it is. And they're keep in mind, I wasn't there at the time. So this is my interpretation of what's in the water data sets. And the reason I have marked those in that way, those specific samples and entries, is that there's a column for the analysis requested or the test requested, something along those lines. And if the test is requested, it will specify, for this sample, we request TVC, Pseudomonas, E. coli coliforms, or in these cases, the test request is very specific.
Yes, so for instance, if you request a test for Elizabeth Kingii Miracola, that's a very specific
It's very specific.
request.
It is.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we have a much better picture now, perhaps, than emerges simply from reading the dry text of how this came to be created. Can I just ask you to go to one page, just in case it's of assistance to us, given the wider context, page 34.
Yes.
Because we're talking here about cuprovidus and other, this sort of cuprovidus and everything else that's gram negative.
It is.
And the top paragraph is dealing with testing in 2A, which of course has been of particular interest for all the reasons that we know. I see here that you note 24 out of the 35 samples from Ward 2A, 68.6% grew one or more of the species, with 3 of these also testing positive for an additional gram negative.
Yeah.
And then a further 9 didn't grow the target organism, but grew something else. Yeah. So you've got quite a high positivity rate of sampling in that ward at that time.
You do, with a caveat that this is the first time this test has ever been done. So you have no indication of a baseline or what would be considered normal.
But even you felt in your dry recording of data way it important to point out that only 2 of the 35 samples from Ward 2A were negative.
Well, that's the fact. Out here, I'm listing the numbers as they were.
Thank you. I don't think I need to take anything more from you about this now that we have a much better idea of why it does or does not contain certain material. Can I ask you some general questions, if I could, since I've got you here, and since you're apparently the person who's on top of all the water material? I know you don't like the word contamination because you say, well, against what standard? But if I could just use that phrase because it's been used by lots of other people, including GGC, can you comment on whether there was systemic contamination of the water system at the new hospital in 2015?
Could we spend a bit of time on that word first? Because...
Well, no, because that's the description that's been given elsewhere. And I just really need to know whether you think it's a correct description or not.
No.
No.
No, I don't.
And why not?
This is where we get into the definition of that word. Because the reason I want to spend a bit of time on that word is that words, the definition matters. Because otherwise, if I understand that word to mean one thing, and you understand it to mean something completely different, then we're talking across each other.
Well, the inference in this case, and this is a phrase lifted from something said by GGC, not mine.
No, of course. And I would have had this same conversation with people in GGC.
Of course. That at the outset, whether it's because the building was half built for a while or whatever it was,
right?
The likelihood is that the system was systemically contaminated.
So now I see. Apologies. When you said widespread contamination, I thought you were talking about the 2018.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but let's start from 2015.
So contamination. I mean, I believe I have said this before, possibly in response to how it's been used, for example, in Dr. Walker's report. The word has a definition, and it means something that's gotten in there that should not be there. Right? It is not a synonym of may pose a possible risk. Risk is completely separate from contamination. You can have water contaminated with chocolate powder.
Can I just take this from you? Because
Yes.
I accept what you say. Definitions are important.
Yes.
It is not a synonym for
Posing a possible risk. I believe those are distinct concepts that at times have been conflated. Contamination from us, now, if I may, a strict definition in the context of water would be something that has gotten into your water system that should not be there. Now, in terms of, now I understand what you're asking is 2015 and GGC's position as to some issues around construction. So contamination would include things like if pipes were left open and debris entered your system, debris should not be in your system. That's a contaminant.
But if it's completely neutral biologically, it wouldn't create a risk, am I right?
Correct, but it's a contaminant. Now, if a consequence of that contamination, which is the debris, is that normal microbial flora have then had nutrients or substrate to proliferate, it's not the normal microbial flora themselves that are the contamination. It's the thing that got into your system that should not be there.
how much weight do you put on gotten into it as opposed to allowed to develop?
So that's a very good question. It brings me to what I would call my slightly looser definition of contamination, because I will concede that it is sometimes used for a situation, say Legionella. Legionella is a normal water organism, that's its niche. So in that sense, occasional detection of Legionella wouldn't meet the definition of contamination because it's a water bug. You expect to see it occasionally in water. This comes back to, can you assume something's there if you've not tested for it? Well, with Legionella, that's its normal environment. Now, I will accept that perhaps if Legionella, if your system has been managed in such a way that Legionella has proliferated, and we're talking to high counts throughout your system that we know pose a risk, then I will concede that that perhaps would meet a looser definition of contamination, but more accurately would be described as microbial proliferation. Contamination, E. coli.
Sorry, more accurately described as?
Microbial proliferation. So a normal member of the water flora has been allowed to grow to numbers that are undesirable. E. coli is a contaminant because E. coli is not a normal water organism. That's not its ecological niche. It's a gut bacterium. So if you find E. coli in your water, that indicates that there's been fecal contamination. Clear definition of contamination. That's why we test for fecal organisms as indicators of contamination. Where the definition, I think, becomes less difficult or less straightforward and perhaps no longer applies is when you start testing for organisms that you've not tested before and you detect species that are normal water flora, that in itself for me does not meet any definition of contamination. If there's no threshold, no accepted threshold at which point that organism, if it's not been tested for before, and if it's what you would expect to see in water, then in order to use the term contamination, surely it's not the presence of the organism that's important. Then we're talking about what levels. So this applies to Legionella, and in fact, it applies to Pseudomonas aeruginosa. There's very good data, and there are guidelines for those. Those guidelines do not transpose. You cannot just extrapolate them to all other gram-negatives, because these are very different organisms.
Sorry, I feel just to follow a step there. When you say these are very different organisms, you're referring to?
Other gram-negatives compared to Legionella and Pseudomonas aeruginosa.
So you can't assume from the results you get for Pseudomonas aeruginosa anything about other organisms.
From a test? Well, no, because you've not tested for them. The point I'm making, though, is interpreting the results of a new test, like the one for gram-negatives, is difficult or indeed impossible without any knowledge of what what normal is. If we've only carried out a test in what we think is an abnormal situation, we do not have any baseline. We don't know what normal looks like. And so defining contamination in that instance is really quite difficult. Because contamination also, it's an emotive word. It's a technical word, but it's an emotive word. And it also implies, because we're fortunate to live in a country where the water coming out of the tap, there's an expectation that it's not contaminated. It's very serious to claim that water is contaminated, because it implies that that should not have happened, and therefore there was something happened that should not have happened. There was possibly mismanagement or negligence. Now I'm saying this is how that word could be interpreted. Now, if that word contamination is being used in a completely new context with no baseline data, that's a problem, I think.
Can I take you back a step?
Please.
If I've followed what you've said. You've identified a difficulty in determining whether or not a state of affairs may probably be described as contamination.
Correct.
I don't think you're challenging the concept of a contaminated water system.
No.
Where the suggested contaminant is a pathogenic microorganism.
Oh, what's a pathogenic microorganism? And that's perhaps a separate question.
Well, in my simple, uneducated way, it is a microorganism which has the potential to result in infection or disease in human beings.
And that would be a reasonable definition. But in the broadest sense, any microorganism could be a pathogen because it is not as straightforward as a bacterium infects a person. The patient factors and vulnerabilities play a large role in whether that organism is pathogenic. So organisms that would not be pathogenic to most of us could, under specific circumstances, be pathogenic to a severely immunocompromised patient with multiple breaches in their physical barriers. By that I mean lines.
That might be accommodated by the word potential.
But in that sense, all microorganisms are potential pathogens. Because if I remember, it was I believe it was Dr. Mumford and Ms. Dempster's report, they presented a definition of a pathogen. And it seemed quite reasonable, but there were specifications. One is that it had to, and I might have to go back and look up this exact quote, but it said causes disease at measurable rates or something to the effect of, there was some statement on frequency. And I think that's perhaps an important part of that definition. And it's, again, I'm not saying that rare instances of infections can occur from organisms that would be normally considered of low pathogenic potential. Of course, this case reports explain these all the time, or report instances of unusual infections. And so if our definition of a pathogen or a potential pathogen is any microbe that has ever been described in a case report of an infection, then all microbes are potential pathogens.
I probably took you away from the
And I probably
from the initial
diverged as well.
from the initial question,
Yeah.
which is, as I understood you, you were pointing to the difficulty of determining whether a state of contamination has been reached.
Yes.
But it seemed to me you were not challenging the concept
No.
of contamination where the contaminant is a microorganism.
No, of course not. No. I think it's very clear in the case of microorganisms from a fecal source. And as I said, I concede that definition could be extended to organisms like Legionella, Pneumophila, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa.
My apologies, Mr. Conlon.
No, I need to take a few things reasonably short with you. So if you could,
Keep my answers short.
well, that would be helpful on occasion, but don't miss out something that you think is key, because obviously I'm keen to hear that.
Yes.
The word contamination, which you have issues with, as we've just discussed, does seem to be reasonably widely used in the context of water systems by lots of people who are spending their days dealing with water systems. You would agree?
I'm not quite sure which group of people you're referring to,
Well,
because I work quite closely, as you've seen, with water engineers and authorizing engineers and facilities. And that's certainly not a word that is used with abandon.
well, no.
It's quite a specific and serious situation. I think that's the point.
Well, I'm thinking in particular of the Water Technical Group, which did a lot of work in 2018 and onwards,
Yeah.
and included experts instructed externally,
No, of course.
experts from Scottish government departments and entities and so on and so forth, and which reached the conclusion that there was widespread contamination in the water system.
Yeah.
Now, what weight can we give to that, given that you don't like the
No, so
word?
I think it's important. I acknowledge that I'm in a fairly privileged position in that I'm looking back on those events. I started in GGC in 2021. I was not involved in the events around that time. And since that time, we've accumulated a lot more data. And so there is a lot more information on what do you detect on a gram-negative test in water. In 2018, at the height of these events, there's a very good chance I would have been just as alarmed at trying a new test and seeing the counts. I mean, I gave the proportions of positivity. That would have been alarming. Now, and so I understand this is not a judgment on anyone's decisions at the time or on the terminology that they used. They were operating, as is often the case in infection control, you're operating with very limited data and having to make some big decisions. And it's only sometimes much later on, when a lot more data has become available, that you can reassess perhaps some of the conclusions that were made at the time on limited data. Do you see the point I'm making is that a lot has changed in our understanding as a result of the concerns at the QE. We now have, I suspect, one of the largest water testing data sets, certainly of any UK hospital. So we have a far more nuanced understanding of the microbiology of water. And another key piece of research, and this I really want to highlight because it was extremely important, and this was the paper, and I think I refer to it, this was the paper by Dr. Inkster, published, I believe, in 2022, where this gram-negative test was performed at 10 other hospitals. Because until that study, as far as I know, it had ever really been done at the Queen Elizabeth. Now, if I don't know if I have an exact bundle number for that, but if it would help, I could look it up if we took a quick break.
I know the one you're referring to. I think Dr. Inkster would say that the amount of testing in the other hospitals was pretty small to reach any firm view.
Oh, no, of course, because it was a study. It was small, but in many of those hospitals, the positivity was 100% for gram-negatives. And the counts were very high. And keep in mind, this was not, those hospitals, there's no suggestion in that paper that they were experiencing, to use the term that's been used, water incidents. This is the normal, presumably the normal background. When you perform a new microbiological test for the first time, it's important context to know what normal is. And that paper, I believe, is quite insightful, because now that in the benefit of hindsight, that paper that study hadn't been done in 2018. They didn't have a baseline. All they had was what looked like an alarmingly high positivity rate. In hindsight, they now know, well, we know, and that paper shows, that when you perform this specific test, remember it's bespoke to the Queen Elizabeth. When you perform that test elsewhere, under presumably normal circumstances, you get positivity rates that are in some hospitals just as high or higher, and you get counts that are just as higher. So that, I think, is important context now when looking back. Because either, and here I'm being quite specific about the gram-negative test results. Those gram-negative test results that you showed me in my report, when you look at them next to the test results from these other 10 hospitals, the Queen Elizabeth doesn't appear to be an outlier. So at the peak of the water incident, the gram-negative test results fall within the range with some variability that we now know is seen elsewhere. Now, unless the suspicion is, well, if we claim that the test results themselves, again, being quite specific, the gram-negative test results are indicators of contamination both in the counts and the species detected. It then follows that these other hospitals would be similarly contaminated. And therefore, that if everywhere is contaminated, that word loses meaning. This is, apologies, circling back, I realize I've talked a lot, but if we're going to apply that word to microbial species that are normal water flora, surely, and that are normal water flora that we now know we see elsewhere, then it's essential that we say what count, how high do they have to be for that to be contaminated?
Whatever happens in other hospitals, the conclusion in 2018 seemed to be that something needed to be done to remove potential pathogens from the water system.
Yeah.
In part because people were reporting unusual infections.
Yes, understandably.
Now, are you saying we place no reliance on that now?
That we place no reliance on what?
The conclusions reached at that time, the actions taken by the assembled experts?
No, of course not. So this is where the infection control, keep in mind, I wear, if you like, two hats. I work in a laboratory, I run a diagnostic test, I do science, but then I'm also on the infection control team. And so I now have a sense of the similarities, but also the differences between those two worlds, if you like. So if I could give an example, perhaps to illustrate this particular challenge with infection control, and I promise it is relevant. Now, through random variability, occasionally cases will look like there are clusters, right? Suppose there's a fixed background rate. That does not mean that those infections will be equally spaced over time. They can occur in clusters. Now, when a cluster is noticed, good infection control will respond. It will, and clinicians hopefully would notice. And perhaps that cluster is a real, by real cluster, I mean, perhaps there's a reason, perhaps there is an incident or something that needs to be managed, but there's a chance it is just random variability. Now, from a perspective of those on the ground who have to respond to these, you don't know which situation you're facing. But good infection control needs to operate on a precautionary principle in that you have to assume that what you're facing is an incident, because you're operating on limited data. You notice the spike and you should respond immediately. But it's incomplete data. It's perhaps very preliminary. Perhaps it's a handful of samples that have a high positivity rate on a test or suspicions of clinical case. And so what infection control then does with the clinical teams and others is launch investigations. And this will be multiple parallel investigations usually, because you don't know what type of situation you're facing. There will be several hypotheses. And it's important that each of those is explored, but that interventions are also put in place for all of them before you know which, if any of them, is indeed what you're facing. So suppose you notice an increase in infections, and none of what I'm saying is meant to dismiss that gut instinct that clinicians have, this sense that, oh, the numbers appear to be increasing, or these little spikes that you see in data. If you get a spike, you have to respond. And I believe that was the case here. There was a noted increase in at various points, 2017, 2018. And immediately, investigations were launched and interventions were put into place, including on the water, because that was one of the hypotheses. I realize this is getting long-winded. I promise I will get to the point. The point is, you had your increase in infections, you put in place multiple different interventions, you investigated in parallel, and now your infections go down. That's what you would hope. The challenge is that, now speaking as a scientist, you have no way of knowing whether one of your hypotheses was entirely correct and that intervention is what brought down the numbers.
Yeah, so if you do 3 interventions, you don't know which of the 3 has succeeded.
Precisely. Or it's not even, it could have been a simple one of them, but you don't know which one. But there are so many factors at play here. It could also be, it was an interplay between a few of them. It was behavioral changes that arose out of the investigation itself. So it was perhaps something completely different. Or it was pure randomness, and I use this word in a technical, statistical way, but that would have resolved itself had you done nothing. But you have no way of knowing that. And of course, you can never test this experimentally. It would be unheard of to say, well, we think it's the water. Let's put filters on half of the ward and see if they have. No, of course not. Infection control has to deviate, and I use this term, has to deviate from scientific practice. Scientific, you would have controls, you would do interventions separately, and then you could know which one worked, if any of them. Infection control doesn't have that luxury. So we need to be extremely careful when confirming causality based on the observation that the numbers decreased after multiple parallel interventions, when it could be one, several, or none of them that actually was the reason for that. And that's a challenge that I don't see a way to overcome it, frankly. Especially when data, and by this I mean infection rates, which I hope, and water testing results, when with the benefit of hindsight and much longer timelines and detailed statistical modeling, when they show that actually what felt like a big peak, and it would, I'm not, again, it's not to diminish how the people facing that situation would have felt. They only knew the numbers they had in front of them. They didn't have the benefit of well, now I think we have 15 years of data in one of the look back exercises. What would have felt like a big peak to those on the ground, in hindsight, if we say, oh, you know, yes, of course, perhaps there's a bit of an increase, but it's not as clear cut as it would have seemed to those on the ground at the time. And so I want to be clear that none of my concerns over things like the use of the word contamination, it's not meant to be a criticism of anything that was done in the heat of the moment. This is coming from several years now of data and far more information and a wider context baseline of what water results are elsewhere. Comparator data that some of the experts obtained, and that was a very useful exercise, was to request data sets from other institutions, but that wasn't available at the time.
Well, I can understand that it's possible that the result, i.e. the disappearance of the infection, for instance, the non-recurrence of the infection, is purely random. It's due to something we don't know. It's nothing we'd thought of. It's something completely...
For factors that we don't yet understand.
Yeah, there's something has happened that we don't know. If you undertake an intervention and things don't improve, you might conclude,
that you're...
randomness apart,
yeah,
that whatever you're doing isn't helping.
Correct.
On the other hand, if you do intervene, perhaps in a variety of ways, because you can't, as you say, experiment on the patients by saying, well, we'll try A and B, but hey, let's not bother with C. If you do intervene and the infections decrease, is there not then at least an argument that says the interventions have been successful, one or more of them?
Possibly, but I would be careful about ascribing causality, because here it's causality, intervention caused a decrease in infection, to something that could be explained by a statistical concept of regression to the mean. Would it help if I explained regression to the mean?
I suspect I wouldn't be any the wiser after you did so, but what you're saying is you don't necessarily accept that proposition.
I'm saying it's not as straightforward as that.
So I'm not suggesting it's straightforward,
Yeah.
because there are all kinds of random possibilities.
No, if you've put in multiple interventions and your infection numbers have decreased, one of the possible explanations is that one or more of those interventions have had an effect. That's fine. No, I'm absolutely not disputing that.
Well, let's see if we can move on, because I want to ask you some reasonably short questions about some other topics, if I can.
Please.
Usually I spend all my time with people looking at their witness statements, and I'm not really going to spend any great time on your witness statement, partly because it's very short, partly because we've covered a lot of other topics. I really just wanted to ask you two things about that.
Matter of housekeeping. Did you ask Dr. Chaput whether she adopted
Yes.
her? You did.
I did.
Right. So
I did.
it's in a formal sense, it's part of the evidence, just as any witness statement
That's
is.
fine.
In your witness statement, and I noticed you used it in your evidence earlier, the word negligent comes up. Now, you use that in paragraph 22 on page 8. You say that there's an inference that the detection of an unusual species points to deficits in the built environment and or negligence. Now, I just want to ask you why you use the word negligence, because I can't remember, now the fault may be mine, but I can't remember anyone actually suggesting that.
No, and apologies if that was too strong a word.
I mean, what one can see, if somebody doesn't do something that they should have done,
Yeah,
and a consequence arises, you can apply various epithets to that.
of course.
And we know that we're talking in a background where, to put it no higher, a lot of effort goes into trying to look after the water in a complex system like the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. The only other thing I wanted to ask you about that area around your witness statement is that there was an exchange with Dr. Mumford, if I can call it that. You raised certain issues, Dr. Mumford replied.
Of course, yeah.
You read the reply. Attempting, given the hour, to try and summarize it short. Am I right in understanding that your complaint, if I can call it that, about the way Dr. Mumford still presents, is that using the reference to unusual organisms, but only in relation to GGC, presents a sort of biased picture?
Yes, but let me specify how I use the term bias. I refer always to an analysis or an approach, right? This is not meant to be an accusation or to imply any intentional bias, right? The term bias is used certainly in the process of academic peer review, for example, when we discuss whether a certain analytical approach might favor unjustifiably so a particular conclusion. And the issue I saw and I raised, and this was based on Dr. Mumford's oral evidence, was that she was quite clear that the GGC list, if I'll use that as a shorthand, had been used to select organisms from the comparator lists, and that the rate was calculated across those. And actually, Mr. Mukherjee said something along those lines in his oral evidence as well, that it was the GGC list that was used to select the organisms in the other comparators. Now, where I say this approach is biased is that in, for example, a situation where there were organisms on the other lists that would meet this definition, but that weren't on GGC's lists, they would be excluded from such an analysis. And so GGC's rate, if that's indeed how it was calculated, would be artificially inflated if we ran the exercise another way and we used the list from Great Ormond Street to select the taxa. It would leave out organisms on GGC's list, and it would be biased against the Great Ormond Street rate. Notice I'm using bias for the analytical approach here. So there was this issue of how these rates were even calculated. Now, I note that Dr. Mumford has corrected this in her response to me, and that's fine. I'm glad. So she's clarified that no, Mr. Mukherjee used all of the organisms that met this definition in his rate calculations. I had attempted to check this, but as you know, I have concerns about some of the other calculations that derive these rates. But if I may, I'd like to separate the organism lists from the rate calculations.
Well, I was just keen to get your answer about your use of the word biased.
Yeah.
I mean, I use, in an analytical sense, are you still suggesting that Dr. Mumford's approach is biased?
If, as she's corrected in her addendum, so if we now consider that what she said in her oral evidence no longer stands but has been corrected, if indeed the full list was used to calculate the rates, then the rate calculation is not biased, but, and this is where I do want to separate out the list from the rates, looking at the lists of organisms itself is informative, right? And understandably, this inquiry has often focused on different versions of this list. What we have not seen before, and what was not presented, and I argue should have been, is the list of organisms from the comparators. Setting aside the rates for now, just the lists, because as I showed, all of these comparators have a fairly noticeably long list of organisms, or some organisms that do not occur elsewhere. They were unique to each hospital. Now, why does this matter? The list itself, various, as I've outlined in this witness statement, and I realize, this is running on a bit, but the way that the list, I feel, has been used is to ask, should these have occurred, right? These questions about background rates. And various highly qualified microbiologists have said, for a large number of these, there should be no background rate. Now, it would be easy, at least my interpretation of that would be, well, if under normal circumstances, these should not occur, and yet here's a long list from GGC where they clearly have occurred, it doesn't take many, it's not a long jump to say, well, then these are not normal circumstances, right?
Can you help? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, of course.
So finish what you're saying, by all means.
So for me, it was, if it appeared that was a possible interpretation, that various witnesses have said these organisms have no background rate and therefore shouldn't occur under normal circumstances.
Well, that was the point I was going to ask your help, because previously when I've heard references to certain organisms having no background rate, I've interpreted that as meaning we do not have sufficient experience with that particular organism to give rise to an expectation of any particular rate. Whereas you are presenting a different interpretation of that expression,
Perhaps.
Which is that you should never find this organism.
This isn't my interpretation. This is me.
I'm looking for help. I'm not challenging what you're saying.
How this line of questioning would have been perhaps interpreted. And I think it's there, if that's even a possibility. If someone says these have no background rate, and it's not one or two, it's a long list. Perhaps I'm interpreting this in a unusual way. But I could see how it would be fairly easy to come to the conclusion that therefore these shouldn't occur, all of these. Now, therefore, in a comparative exercise, looking at lists from other places could either support or refute that. Suppose the lists from the comparators had been presented and they were relatively short and they were, if you like, the more common ones. and they did not have this big trailing tail of more unusual things, then if GGC stood out, that would be evidence that perhaps something abnormal had happened. Would that be reasonable? If GGC's list was very long, with a lot of organisms that several people say should have no background rate, and then the comparators, had you been shown that, if those lists had been very short, that suggests there's something different about GGC. Now, so I think it's important to show, for context, what do the lists of organisms look like from the other hospitals?
I think probably for the inquiry's purposes, it's sufficient if I understand your point, and I think I do. I hope I do at least.
Okay, basically I say, for context, in a comparative exercise, one should show the data from the comparators, including the lists of organisms. Because one thing that did come out is, for example, Mycobacterium occurred in most of the comparators. Now, perhaps I missed it, but I don't think this evidence was ever put forward to the inquiry. But those, and given the understandable focus on that organism, it seemed relevant in order to be able to interpret the data from the QE is to know what other hospitals experience in terms of that particular genus of organism, as one example. So showing the list. So back to the question of bias, the rates, if the rates were indeed calculated from the full agglomerated list, that does address that concern of the calculation. I have other various, very serious concerns about how those rates were calculated. But that would be addressed by the full inclusion of the list. However, presenting only GGC's list and not the list from the other hospitals as a communication approach, I believe, is biased.
Let me try and ask you something else.
I'll try
about
to keep my
something else.
answer shorter.
That would, again, be very helpful, just based
In the
on
interest
pure
of time.
practicalities that we're faced with. I have a lot of questions I could have asked you, but I'm going to shorten it because for all kinds of reasons, it's preferable that we can conclude your evidence
Of course.
shortly. You were a contributor, I can use that word, to GGC's Direction 5 response, to an appendix to it that we see in Bundle 44 at Document 1, Volume 3 at Document 1. If we could have that.
Yes.
And that's Dr. Peters' response. We want the GGC one, which is Document 1. Now, if we flip through this to the appendix, because there's some narrative and then there's an appendix.
Yeah.
Can we just continue? Were you a contributor to this document?
Of course, yes. My name's on it.
Is this the one where it said by you and contributed to by?
Infection control doctors. Yeah.
And who were they?
There were 3. It was Dr. Merrick, Dr. Bagrad, and Dr. Bal.
What was the last name was?
Bal, B-A-L.
Thank you. And is it possible to work out who did what?
If you have specific paragraphs, I could explain whether I contributed a little bit, a lot, or not at all.
Right. So you all contributed to the text.
Yes. I took the lead in writing it, but based on discussions. And some sections were drafted by others, and we all reviewed the final.
But there's a lot of material in that document that we might characterize as argument
Of course.
or presentation rather than evidential material. I had a note about paragraph 15. I don't know where that is. It's not cropping up here.
No, further down, I believe the appendix.
Oh, yes.
That's the one.
We're in the wrong appendix. We were in appendix 1, not appendix 2.
This is the correct one.
So I'm only going to identify one or two what you might describe as factual or statements just to see who's responsible for them. Now, in paragraph 15, there's a statement asserting a lack of knowledge of microbiological water testing and the purpose of the NIPCM appendix. Who contributes that bit?
I drafted that, but we all contributed.
Right. And is that from your own knowledge?
Yes, but also through discussions with others.
And we go to paragraph 18. Again, there's a statement that a paragraph is incorrect, and we'll ask about that when other witnesses come. Who produced
I
that?
did. I wrote that.
That's yours again.
Yeah.
And how do you know when you say there's no way the laboratory would have failed to report the isolation of Enterobacter?
Because Enterobacter is a coliform, as we've been through, and there are strict rules on coliforms. These are widely adopted thresholds that there can be no coliforms in water. And this water testing laboratory is UCAS accredited and therefore meets quite rigorous standards. And so it would be obliged to report an Enterobacter in water. And that's just, that's a factual, this is to correct a factual statement, is that this was in response, I believe, to
Something Professor Stevens says.
it's this, if I can, this is in response to this particular wording. It is highly probable that the actual number of total Enterobacter was much higher than this.
And you don't
that's
accept
the
that
statement
proposition?
that I do not accept, because that implies that a UCAS accredited environmental testing laboratory is identifying Enterobacter and not reporting them. And I needed to request that be corrected.
We go to 24, paragraph 24. This is just so I can take the matter further in due course. There are comments about blood storage. Sample storage there. Is that you?
This was joint. This had more input from, the infection control doctors are also consultant microbiologists. So, but myself as well. This was joint.
I see.
And I believe it's about the timing or how long isolates should be stored. And it's because of some either implicit or explicit criticism that for the retrospective whole genome sequencing work, some of the very earliest isolates weren't available.
The final point I just want to ask, while we've got that open, you comment in paragraph 25, or whoever, comment in 25 that the CNR authors allude to deficiencies in IPC practices.
That was a comment from the ICDs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because there is a section in the overview report in which the CNR authors deal with IPC practices.
This was something that the ICDs felt quite strongly that they wanted added.
Very well. Thank you. Now, I think, my Lord, I'm probably getting to the end of the questions that I need to ask, apart from I just want to ask one series of questions just because we have the slightly awkward situation, we don't have a document here for reasons that I think have been explained to you. I just want to deal with that briefly so it goes on the record and everybody then knows openly what's being done.
Of course.
That Wednesday last week you sent a document to the inquiry which included something called supporting evidence
Yes.
deduplication, in which, among other things, you set out a critique of deduplication of GGC data. Is that correct?
Yes, that's new.
Um,
There are other,
there are other criticisms there,
and those
accept.
have been raised before.
But so far as the deduplication of the GGC data, that is new.
That is new, and if I may add, the deduplication of the GOSH data is new.
Right.
Concerns about that, because that arose from the data table that Dr. Mumford provided in her addendum, so her response to me. So that was new information to me, where she showed Dr. Mukherjee or Mr. Mukherjee's workings for Great Ormond Street as evidence that he had included the organisms in his rate calculation.
Now,
But
the deduplication, any issue of deduplication of GGC data has been, well, that data has been around for some considerable time, has it not?
it has, yeah.
And
Why have I only raised it now?
why have you only raised it now? Because you'll appreciate
No, it
creates a practical issue.
of course, and it's a fair question. And the blunt answer is that it did not occur to me that I would have to go and check those numbers. That when Mr. Mukherjee outlined how he had deduplicated the data, that he had done so. That's the end of my answer. And it's only, if I may continue, it's only because of his workings for Great Ormond Street, which were shared at the end of July in Dr. Mumford's response, and concerns over how those numbers were computed, because when you compare those, and I show this, he did not compute the Great Ormond Street numbers correctly. And let me point something out here. It was not in GGC's interest for me to point out that the Great Ormond Street numbers might have been inflated. It would have looked much better for us if, assuming our numbers had been deduplicated, but as I pointed out back in December, Leeds did not provide deduplicated data. They state that in their return. That favors us. In these charts, these comparative charts, if the Leeds numbers are inflated and ours are supposedly deduplicated, if I wanted to be biased towards GGC, I would not have mentioned this.
No, you'll be pleased to know I'm not about to ask you if you're biased. Dr.
No,
Chaput.
but I think it's important because there are multiple different types of, shall we call them, disagreements around many aspects of this. And some of those types of disagreements I would classify as reasonable professional disagreements. Which approach is better? How do you interpret this? Should we use bed days or total admissions? Frankly, I don't think it's that. As long as the person doing the analysis has a good reason and can justify it, neither of those approaches is invalid. How do you interpret causality? You will hear different answers, and there will be some disagreement. And this is in the category of reasonable professional disagreement. The concerns I've tried to raise, and this is not limited to the deduplication. These concerns have been raised in the Direction 5 responses to Mr. Mukherjee's work, they're a different category of concern or disagreement. And those ones are what I would call factual or analysis, technical analysis steps that are incorrect. And those ones, I can demonstrate. We shouldn't have to exchange responses and rebuttals because, for example, for leads, which the claim was made that those data were deduplicated, I would ask that you look at the leads FOI response, and they state, we do not telepath something. I have it here, but you have it as well. Not yet public. I appreciate that, but I believe I outlined this at the end of my comparative organism report from December. They state we did not deduplicate as telepath. Our telepath system does not carry information on what constitutes an episode. There's no ambiguity here, right? It's not a matter of opinion whether leads deduplicated their data or not. They said in black and white that they did not. Similarly, Cardiff and the Vale, one of the other comparators, stated that they did deduplicate. But they did not say which criteria they used, what the definition. And I know there's been discussion about whether it should be 14 days from the first sample or 14 days from the last sample. That point is moot if the deduplication hasn't occurred at all. Or if the deduplication has been done by single sampling date, because other ways to interpret the term deduplication would be, for example, if a patient has a line and it has 2 ports, and in one sampling event, they have different samples, and each sample grows an organism, the same organism, one interpretation of deduplication would be that those are combined for a single day. So it's not clear how Cardiff and Vale deduplicated their data. It's certainly not clear how or if Oxford deduplicated their data. And as I explained, and I'm not referring to the document you received last week, I'm referring to the comparator organism report. Would it help to have a document number or?
No, we know the
Okay.
one you're referring to.
So these are not reasonable professional disagreements. I was expecting to have plenty of those. We've perhaps had some of those today. This is a different type of concern. And the concern is that those calculations and the comparisons are invalid. And I choose that word carefully because it's a strong word. But from an analytical point of view, you cannot compare these institutions the way that it has been attempted. Now, in preparing my response to, or in preparing for today, I read Dr. Mumford's addendum. There were some useful points of information, I think, or clarifications, in that she has confirmed that it's not her position that GGC's lists of organisms was any different. She states that. It's her position that it's the rates as calculated by Mr. Mukherjee. So a lot is resting on how Mr. Mukherjee calculated those rates. And if you completely set aside, I appreciate the document I shared with the additional concerns was only prepared, it was very quick for me as well. Let's set that aside. The concerns I raised in that comparator report, where I clearly state Leeds did not deduplicate. Cardiff and Vale said they deduplicated, but we have to assume that they did it by exactly the same criterion that Mr. Mukherjee did. Oxford doesn't say how or if it deduplicated. The way that their tables are presented suggests the deduplication could only have been partial. Great Ormond Street provided a very detailed return. Hats off to whoever at Great Ormond Street prepared that, because it is very well done. So I had assumed at least Great Ormond Street was fully deduplicated because they provide a column with a 14-day episode count. Now, the additional material I shared last week was when I realized from Dr. Mumford's table that the gauge calculations are wrong. So Mr. Mukherjee has not correctly added up Gauch's episodes, but it's not, of course, I say this because I'm able to show with the information that you hold on your servers, this is nothing new. If you have the FOI return from Great Ormond Street and Dr. Mumford's addendum, as I outlined, please put them side by side. Mr. Mukherjee's calculations do not align with a fully deduplicated Great Ormond Street dataset. Now, of course, I was in a position where I saw, Great Ormond Street's numbers are potentially artificially inflated. Leeds numbers are artificially inflated. That actually looks worse for GGC. So I went back just to check, because perhaps that's true. And that's where additional concerns arose, as I've outlined. All this stems from Dr. Mumford sharing a snapshot of Mr. Mukherjee's workings for Great Ormond Street. But even that new data aside, the concerns about deduplication alone render that comparison invalid. And this was Dr. Mumford responded to this comparator report, but did not address that part of it. She still relies for her conclusions on that rate calculation and on this ratio. GGC's so much higher than the others. A lot relies on that rate calculation. And as we know, there have been concerns about the denominators. I believe we're now on the third attempt at getting a rate that is remotely comparable at the denominator level, because there were decisions to exclude GGC's day case admission numbers, but retain them, use the totals for the comparison. That's invalid. Now, let's say the denominator issue has perhaps been resolved to some extent, but the numerators are equally invalid. And it was really important that, and thank you for this opportunity, because it's important to distinguish this type of concern, which is numerical and demonstrable and not a matter of opinion, and the fact that I work for GGC with whatever biases come with that, does not affect what's written on the lead's return saying that they did not deduplicate their data. This is a different category of concern.
Well, I think that's been helpful, Dr. Chaput, because as you say, you have taken an opportunity to expand an answer in order to explain the
I
nature of
have.
your concern, whether or not you were asked a question about it. That, by the by, I'm proposing to finish my questioning at this point. I don't think anything will be gained by continuing it. I have had other questions from other parties, but I'm not sure whether there's anything else in the room that we
Well,
would need to do tonight.
Well, on the other hand, as things stand, this is the opportunity to ask Dr. Chaput questions. And I appreciate the hour is a little later than we usually sit, but it's only a little later. And therefore, I would propose to follow our usual practice of giving legal representatives the opportunity to make any proposals to Mr. Connell that they wish to do. If you could perhaps, this might take us about 10 minutes, Dr. Chaput. So could I ask you to return to the witness room?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Connell.
I have a small number of questions, Lord. Whether I can get short answers to them remains to be seen.
Well, we shall see. Some further questions, I understand.
I'll attempt to keep my answers short, I promise.
That would once again be much appreciated. First of all, really almost it's a point that I think I was starting to put to you and then it got cut off by one of
Apologies.
your answers. It's simply to make the point, which just so you, it's almost not a question. It's more to make the point that the document we've just been discussing that you produced last week, which has some new challenges to figures, is not one that the other participants
Of course.
who are present here today have seen, and they will not see until it's annexed to Dr. Mukherjee's consideration and response to it, which hopefully will be very soon.
Yes. So
it won't actually emerge. So that when we're having a discussion about it, I take it you understand that that's a constraint.
Of course. Yeah.
A couple of questions about the involvement of what I might describe as national agencies in the context of discussing your presentations, and so on and so forth. You did mention NSS Assure.
NHS Assure.
NHS Assure.
NHS Scotland Assure,
Sure.
I believe is their full title.
Now, you were working at the time that you did the deal with a significant challenge to the
Yes.
reopening of 2A. Are you aware that they offered to come and inspect and were told no?
I don't remember, I'm afraid. I was not involved in the discussions happening with NHS Assure.
The other point is it just at the risk of getting you excited again by using the word contamination. We know that I mentioned earlier in the question the water technical group and so on and so forth.
Of course.
And that then led finally in 2019 to a report by the government agency Health Protection of Scotland, which was to have recommendations for the whole of the NHS in Scotland. Do you know what that was entitled?
I presume, based on this line of questioning, that it includes the word contamination.
It does.
Yeah.
And that's what you say is, with hindsight, incorrect.
This is where incorrect. I reserve for the second type of objection. This is what I would call a reasonable professional disagreement.
Okay, thank you.
I reserve the terms incorrect and invalid for demonstrable errors.
Okay. When you were asked to just carry out an exercise, assemble all these water testing results to produce your report in 2023.
Starting in 2021.
Starting in 2021, but ultimately a report that we saw. And you narrated at the start of that report which agencies were involved, what DMA Canyon were doing, and various changes in that.
Yeah.
Were you aware at that time that there was a question as to the appointment of appropriately trained people to supervise water at the Children's Hospital?
I was vaguely aware of discussions around that, but no.
Here's another question that we could probably have usefully asked you earlier. We know that the report shows that in the years prior to, say, March, April 2018, there was a relatively modest number of water tests being done, given the size of the campus that we're dealing with.
Yes, that's fair.
Do you have any view as to whether that testing regime at that time adequately met what was required by guidance, particularly SHTM 0401?
Bearing in mind this is looking back several years.
Indeed.
Before I was even employed with NHSGGC. As far as I understand, the guidance in place was fairly limited in what it suggested in terms of routine water testing. And my understanding was that broadly, that guidance was being followed.
But do you have any detailed knowledge on that, or that's just something
No,
you're...
that's something
Yeah.
that's my interpretation looking back.
Now, finally, I have 2 or 3 questions about biofilm, which I've been asked to put to you by one of the other participants. I realise biofilm can be a very complex,
It is.
technical topic. So I'm hoping that we can nevertheless come to reasonably concise answers to these. The first question is, if you leave water in a large holding tank where there's not much throughput, it's not flushed in the sense that an outlet would be, is that the kind of activity that could lead to the formation of biofilm?
Yes. Stagnation.
And if biofilm is not either disturbed or by flushing or adequately dealt with by other forms of disinfection, can it evolve over time?
Yes, absolutely.
And become more complex?
In microbial ecology, this term succession is first there are a few organisms that colonize, they set the ground, and then additional species are able to settle, and that's a term called succession. It's also how soils form from rocks. It's a well-known phenomenon.
Yeah. And finally, hopefully, is one of the issues with mitigation measures trying to deal with biofilm, whether that's disinfectant or whatever it happens to be, the risk that in attacking the biofilm, you cause the biofilm then to release its content of microorganisms into the water system, where they then make an appearance elsewhere.
Yes, that's quite a reasonable. It's quite easy to picture how that could happen.
Thank you very much. I have nothing further more.
Dr. Chaput, I think that's all we have for you, and you're therefore free to go. But thank you for your attendance this afternoon. Thank you for your careful answers, and thank you for what is clearly a considerable amount of work that you've put in relation to the inquiry and in preparation for your evidence today. So thank you very much, and you're free to go.
Thank you.
Well, I think probably that brings us to an end of today, but we'll see each other, all being well, tomorrow, 10 o'clock, as I understand it, with Dr. Drumright.
And Mr. McIntosh. Mr. McIntosh will be dealing with Dr.
And
Drumright.
Mr. McIntosh will be leading that evidence. So can I wish everyone a pleasant evening.